All right, this is going to be a Hemlock reaction video, I guess. I've been wanting to do some videos like this in response to stuff, news and stuff that I take in online here and there. But I'm still getting old episodes of the podcast moved over to YouTube and then finishing out that series, that last series that we're in. But I'm just going to start doing this because there's just a list of clips that I want to talk about. It's getting too lengthy to keep just waiting till I get this backlog uploaded and that series completed. I watch a lot of Tim Pool, and over the years, this is someone who I've really taken a liking to. I find myself sometimes criticizing him in my mind. I think, for instance, I have thought, although he's made some arguments that have moved me, but I have thought that he's too soft about the 2020 election here and there. But whatever, that's not the point here. I find this guy to be a really astute thinker, a really like incisive, perceptive, political mind, and I think he's really valuable to listen to. And there is a little segment here from his show sometime last week, where he and Andy No get into a discussion about. I mean, essentially, it's about who's a communist and who's not. Now, this is interesting if you listen to my podcast, all three of you, right? This is interesting because I did this series called Unmasking Antifa a few years ago, okay? And at the time, I was sort of vaguely aware that when I was recording that series, there were some other like public thinker people doing like analyses of Antifa and giving their take on who and what Antifa is and what it amounted to. That was right around the time Mark Levin had that book that came out. Now I forget what it's called, but he was essentially American Marxism. Okay, that book. That's really around the time-ish where Jordan Peterson was really starting to push hard on the left's ideology and how their academic philosophies and how it leads to a lot of really like important points in particular, like in our political life today. I mean, like I've said before, there's a lot of overlap in the kinds of things that Jordan Peterson and I talk about. But I say that because so there's other people who gave analyses of Antifa at the time, and I wanted to offer mine, and that's what that 15-part series is. And I felt like offering it because I felt like I had a different take on it, or a different depth of take on it, an angle on it that was not being given elsewhere. I still feel that way. I always look back at my past stuff like, you could have done that better, bro. But whatever, right? You just got to do your thing. The reason I say that is because another person at the time who I believe was involved in that discussion was this guy named Andy No. And I apologize because I don't know a lot about Andy No, but I'm vaguely aware of him because I'm vaguely aware of a lot of stories from that time and the present about him sort of being on the front lines between this battle between, right-minded people and the sort of like cultural Marxist left at the sort of academic, youth student level. Okay, he's someone who's like targeted by Antifa and such, and has gone through the whole canceling thing. And it's kind of like I think he wrote a book on Antifa. Forgive me, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just saying I don't know his work specifically, but I'm aware of him as being someone who participated and participates in a lot of the same kind of discussion. And so I was watching Tim Pool today, and a Tim Pool episode from last week, and Tim Pool and Andy No get into a really interesting back and forth. And it's interesting because I'm sort of surprised that Tim has to make the point that he's making to Andy. And I didn't even finish the clip before I decided to comment on it here. So I don't know if Andy gets it by the end of the clip. He should, and I guess we're going to see that. I'll let it play all the way through, and we'll talk about it. But Tim makes, I think, a really obvious and important point, and I think it would be good to walk through it because I'm surprised for Andy, as someone who's been dealing with what he's dealing with, I think, that this needs to be pointed out. But I think that Tim does a really good job of pointing it out. So the discussion starts in this clip. I'm not going to play the beginning of it, but the discussion starts because they're talking about some random journalist who had said one thing about Trump one week, then turned around and said a completely different thing about Trump in a headline the next week. And they're all sitting around this round table, and they're trying to reconcile how people can be so double-minded that a journalist can be like, Trump, in one breath, Trump's a moderate, right? It's a huge article about Trump being a moderate, and then the next breath turns around and says Trump's a fascist. It's like, how can these two things? How can people be so double-minded? Where does this seeming duplicity, come from? And that's the launch point for the discussion. And Tim sort of fixates on this point about, for these people, it's not so much truth. I mean, it's not at all truth that they're preoccupied with. And so not being preoccupied with truth leaves them flexibility to adopt whatever position they need to adopt in order to do the larger thing they're trying to do. And then the conversation sort of shifts towards what is the larger thing that they're trying to do. And Tim is like, they're communists, right? They have an authoritarian mindset, and so they will say and do whatever's necessary, right, to move people in the direction they want them to move, and they'll adopt internally inconsistent position. It's not about the truth or the coherency of what they're saying. It's about sorry. There we go. It's not about the truth or the coherency or the logic of the position at all. They don't believe in any of those things, as you might have started to learn in our series called Mind the Gap, which we're in the podcast right now. But bracket that, put that to the side. For them, it's about marching in unison and not being perceived by their own party and by their own group as being outside of this, what we called in Unmasking Antifa, this ideology, okay? A person who is an ideologue is not motivated intellectually by the pursuit of truth. They're motivated intellectually by adherence to a framework. And so when they look at a fact, they look at it through the lens of their framework, and they interpret it according to the framework rather than letting the facts inform and alter and update their framework, right? They've got this is the old adage, the old idiom. They've got rose-colored glasses on, so everything they look at is rose-colored, right? It's not the thing. That is, their framework, their lens informs what they see, rather than the opposite, which is commonsensically the right way to proceed, right? Science, okay? The difference between ideology and science, okay? Or empiricism and science, or just level-headedness and responsible intellectual, responsible intellectual practice. So that's the point at which we enter the discussion, okay? And so I'm going to let Tim talk, and then you're going to see Andy No jump in at a certain point and be like, well, look. They're so quick to castigate the people on the right. The left is so quick to castigate the people on the right as fascists and all that stuff. But Andy gets all like, virtuous. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's just like he makes this move that you often see people on the right who I think don't have the confidence in their own position that they should have. You often see them make a move like this where they're like, well, we need to make sure that we don't do this same thing. We do it too. It's like this. It's like this. I think a long time ago, Jonah Goldberg, I don't care for him, he called this meaningless difference splitting. Okay. And I think that a lot of times when people do this, it's a move of, I'm not calling Andy No a coward. I'm not calling him a coward, but I think that it can be a move that facilitates cowardice. Okay? Because you don't want to call out the thing that needs to be called out, but you do want to call it out, so you split the difference. You call it out and you're like, oh, but we're guilty of it too. So it's like, what was the point? It's like, if it was worth calling out, then call it out, bro. Right? And Tim, I think, catches Andy on this. And again, I'm not coming at Andy No. He seems to me like a very careful, very responsible thinker, but to Tim's credit here, what he's doing in this particular clip, I don't think is right or responsible, and I think Tim does a good job of identifying it. So I'm going to play the clip, and we're just going to comment on it here and there.
I think people don't want to be outside their bubble. I think, and conservatives are guilty of this too, that we shouldn't, pretend otherwise, but some people just want to be told the way they see the world is completely correct. They want to have all their biases confirmed always.
But I think that's what's really dividing the left and the right in the culture war is no longer politics. I think It's obvious to anybody who's been watching a show like this for a long time. It is simply, are you someone who is an independently minded person, or are you someone who is terrified of being shunned?
And that terrified of being shunned, right? This is kind of the point of the Hemlock, right? Why did Socrates drink the Hemlock? Philosophy 101 students, ancient philosophy students. Why do you drink the Hemlock? Well, he was not terrified of being shunned. He embraced being shunned because he understood. And I'm not like making Socrates into Jesus or anything here. That's not what I'm doing. But look, he embraced it because he trusted in his own thought process. He trusted in his reason. He trusted in his logic. He trusted in his assessment of the facts, right, about the accusations that were made towards him by Miletus and others. I'm talking about the apology of Socrates here, right? Why did he drink the hemlock? Because he was not terrified of being shunned. They threatened him with being shunned, and he was like, well, look, I've walked you through the arguments. Here's the conclusions I've reached. Do you have anything to say about these, or are you just calling me names, bro? You're just calling me names, and you're saying I have to call myself that same name, or I'm shunned. Thanks, no thanks. You know, hard. What do they say? Hard pass. I'll be shunned. I'll drink the hemlock. That's why it's called the 40-ounce hemlock. Okay, so Tim he's so good at sort of just like Tim is good at, I think, stopping the conversation when it's getting ahead of where he's at and getting his points in. And I think he does a good job of catching where this is going and saying, whoa, hold on a second. Are we doing the same thing? Do conservatives do the same thing? So here we go again.
Democrats basically just march in lockstep with whatever acceptable opinion is, whatever popular thing currently is. And it changes and catches people off guard, and they get yelled at and they apologize and they freak out. The reason why they'll get so irrationally angry at the idea of you defending Donald Trump is because they know you're right.
Yeah.
When the media lies about Donald Trump and then you say, well, Trump never did that, they'll start yelling at you. Why are you defending him? Why? The reason they're getting angry is because they're like, uh-oh, I'm going to get ostracized. I will get targeted if you keep talking like this. I've got to show that I'm against him. I'm not one of you.
Yeah. I've got to be seen as within the framework. I've got to all right. He's not to the point yet. The point of clash between him and Andy is coming up here. And it's not an overt, it's not a fight, it's not an argument, it's not explicit, but there's a very concrete point that they're differing on. And again, like I said, I've not watched this clip to the end. I'd really like to see if Andy gets to where Tim's at, because Tim's absolutely right, as you'll see in a moment.
Yeah. It's like they realized what they've been doing for so long, and they realized they can turn against him,
It's like when was it David Hogg said he was going to keep wearing masks even though they got rid of the mandates because he didn't want someone to think he was a Republican.
Yeah,
they are so terrified of being the out group.
The mask.
So what happens is,
and that's all it was ever
it
about.
It doesn't matter.
Go back to my episodes about during the COVID episodes, right? Everybody wear the mask. That's all it's about. The mask was not about health. The mask was about flagging, putting a sign on you that said, I'm one of you. Okay, that's why I want to wear a mask.
Or if you're pro-life, pro-choice, it matters, are you in the cult or not? Mm-hmm. You can be in the cult and you can be someone like, Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney, or Joe Walsh. They are obvious.
All putatively Republicans, right? See, the politics doesn't matter anymore. And again, this was a big point of unmasking Antifa. There's something way deeper, more spiritual going on at the level of ideology. And we talked about the way that those ideologies get created and reinforced. They come from a deeper philosophical outlook on the world and how you interpret right and wrong and good and evil and all that. Okay, it's an ideology. It's not empirical. Okay.
As cult members. It's the funniest thing to see Democrats have a high approval rating for George W. Bush. So long as you are part of the machine cult, the cathedral, there you go.
Okay, so I just want to identify this point. He's saying not everyone on the left or that's doing the work of the left. That might be a good way to put it, given what we're going to say here in a moment. Everyone doing the work of the left, everyone doing the work of the communists is not on paper. They're not carrying a card that says communist. They're not a card carrying member of the Communist Party, right? And and that seems like a pretty obvious point. Philosophers they have this distinction in philosophy called the materiality formality distinction. Like there's a material there, in other words, I can be a communist formally, right? I can have a card in my wallet that says I'm a member of the Communist Party, but that's not the only way to be a communist. Another way to be a communist is to be a communist materially. See, formally versus materially. What does it mean to be a communist materially? It means to do what communists do and say what communists say. To act with the communists. That's materially, right? It's not at the level of what you say and at the level of ideas. It's like, how are you behaving in the world? What are you doing? You're behaving the way a communist behaves. You're a communist, bro. And that seems very clear. right? And Tim doesn't ever come out and say material, formal, but this is the distinction that he's catching, or he's going to catch in a moment. Andy No on.
Do you guys think people on the right are
This is Andy No.
a bit too loose in their accusations of their political opponents of being communists and socialists?
Nope.
And you don't?
Nope. You see, okay.
Why?
There's the confident, absolutely not, from Tim, because he gets this intuitively, and I'm just so surprised that someone like Andy No, who's been faced down by this faceless mob, this idiocy, the Marxist idiocy that's so rampant in our day. It seems like he's like on the front lines against that, and I'm surprised at this point. Like I said, I don't know how this ends, but I'm surprised that this point needs to be made to him.
So there's, as we've been talking about this quite a bit over the past couple of weeks, the banality of evil and malicious evil, or, as I go even further, say abject evil. So how did the Nazis, how were they able to pull off what they pulled off?
This distinction between malicious evil and the banality of evil, or you could say, and banal evil, or however you want to, align it. This maps very well onto the distinction between being formally a communist and materially a communist, right? Not everybody who does evil stuff is doing it because they're thinking in their head, this is evil and I want to execute a plan that is evil, and this is a means towards my evil goal, right? That's explicit evil, right? But that's not the only way to be evil. Another way to be evil, that's the formal evil, right? There's material. Another way to be evil is just to go along with and do what those people are doing. Whether you're talking about it, chirping about it, writing about it, reading about it, right? At the level of ideas, that's besides the point. If you're doing what those people do, right, then you're one of them. This is the distinction between the banality of evil and explicit evil. And like I said, it closely tracks this idea of being a material communist versus a formal communist, or vice versa, a formal communist versus a material communist. I'll let Tim talk now.
Where did we hear this? I think someone was talking about it here on the show, maybe, that there was a group of regular guys that were conscripted in World War II, and when they became police officers, and when they were ordered to just start, gunning down and rounding up the Jewish people for the concentration camps, without question, they just did as they were told.
Yeah.
Michael Malice often says that there is I don't know, I can't say the exact quote, I'll paraphrase, but something to the effect of, there is no crime so egregious that police would not carry it out if ordered to, up to and including the murder of children. I certainly think that would be the case if they were instructed to do so, as we saw in Lahaina, when we have all these missing children and people are saying that they were in the cars trapped, and the police were blocking the exit to Lahaina so that people were trapped in the road, and they were burning to death.
Just doing what
and then
they're
some of
told.
these people jumped out of their cars and jumped into the water while the cops held the road closed because they don't care. Now, did those officers wake up and decide that they were going to go murder a bunch of people? Of course not. They were stupid people who did not care for the responsibilities of their job, who were told, don't let anyone leave town. Not explicitly, but they said, shut this road down. And they went, you got it. And so while the fires were burning people to death, there were cops like, don't care. So when it comes to the accusations of the right, on the left.
Okay, you're right. So see where we're going here? So he said, what is he talking about when he says the accusations of the right? He's saying, it was just asked a moment ago by Andy if conservatives or people on the right, whatever, I hate this right-left thing, as you know from past episodes, because it's based on the leftist outlook. The right and left is defined according to leftists, which doesn't make any sense, right? But ignore all that. The question was asked by Andy a moment ago. Don't you think we've got to be careful not to do the same thing they do? When they're like, you're all fascists, we got to be careful to not be like, you're all communists. And this is the point that Tim has rightly paused the conversation or slowed the conversation down and been like, whoa. You're saying this is the same thing that we do as that they do? I beg to differ, bro.
Right.
From the right, about the left, then that's what I meant by on the right, they're making these accusations. I don't think it's incorrect to say that they're communists. Did every single communist in the Soviet Union who supported the system or participated in it know that they were communists? Did they read literature on Marx?
No.
Or were they just doing as they were told?
Just doing as they were told.
They were just doing as they were told. It was the commonplace ignorance that led to these evil actions. So
this is the difference between explicit evil and the banality of evil, as Tim keeps harping on, right? And what we just talked about, formal communism versus material communism. Just because you're not wearing a shirt that has a hammer and sickle on it doesn't matter if we can be wearing a plain blue T-shirt too. But if you're doing what a communist does, if you're behaving in the world as a communist would behave, all right, then you're materially a communist, and so it's not wrong to call you a communist. We mean you're materially a communist. You're doing what a communist does. I don't care if you've read the Communist Manifesto or not, right?
So you have high-profile individuals like people in the Fulton County DA's office charging Donald Trump. They're evil. You have the people in New York City that are filing these lawsuits, falsely accusing Trump of things, or trying to charge him on these BS charges. You've got the documents case against him. All of this is complete garbage nonsense. You have.
I have to pause it because Tim used this word evil, and I want you to appreciate at least I think this is more something about Tim's development lately. And I'm not I don't watch every episode of this. I'm not trying to like sun this guy at all. Please, I mean, I really respect this guy. I'm not trying to analyze him like he's on the couch and I'm, the objective. I think that Tim lately has really gotten a sense of the spiritual component of the cultural political fight we're in. And so is Jordan Peterson, right? The people who are closest to the truth are the people who have begun to identify, and I talked about this in a previous episode of the current series on the podcast, I'm sorry, that it's and this was the point at the beginning of Unmasking Antifa. Once we can see that the person is making the facts what they want them to be, and they're not finding the facts there. They're looking through this lens and saying, I see them this way. This is what critical race theory is. You don't teach critical race theory. It's a lens through which you look at the facts that you're teaching. And so it's a way you color the facts for the person you're teaching. You don't teach critical race theory. It's a lens. It's a framework, right? So the question becomes, once we see that they're doing this, now we got to give some account as to why. And why would they do, like, how can they not see that this is what they're doing? It's because there is a spiritual component to it. Okay, there is a moral component to it. Okay, it comes out of the spirit. It does not come out of the mind. Okay, it's evil. They're participating in evil. Okay, what kind of spirit participates in evil? Okay, Tim is really coming back to this point again and again and again lately, it seems to me, and he's very unafraid and he's very ready to call evil evil. And be like, no, let's not analyze it past that point. He keeps saying, and I know if you watch this show, these people are evil.
The Democrats who in 2016 claimed falsely that Russia manipulated the election to help Donald Trump win and Trump was illegitimate. Then 2020 comes around, and when the opponents of Biden start saying similar things about fraud, they say, you're all crazy psychopaths, et cetera, et cetera. They are a combination of all things evil. Powerful interests at the top who say things like, can't we just drone this guy? In reference to Julian Assange in London. Hillary Clinton is evil. But then you have the blind, ignorant followers. So if you have high-profile activists who raise...
There is formal evil and there is material evil.
Hundreds of millions of dollars who say that they are Marxists, explicitly, that's Black Lives Matter. And then you have people marching in the street, throwing up the red salute in support of overt communism. They're communists. Yeah. They don't have to sit there and put their hand on the Bible of Marx, Das Kapital, and things like that. Yeah. They just need to be cogs in the machine that actively support the issue of communism. Yeah. And then you have people.
And so this is why what was done earlier by both this girl and Andy No needs to be guarded against this equivocation. This what's been called meaningless difference splitting, where you make what seems to be an important point, a charge against a group of people or person, or identify something in someone's position that needs to be rectified, or some moral failing or some intellectual failing, and then you go, but everybody does it, or but we do it. It's like, okay, wait, like that you saw Andy No be like, well, don't conservatives do this too? You got all the leftists, you got Black Lives Matter, you got Occupy Wall Street, you got Antifa, you got, way back in the day, the MoveOn.org folks. You're a fascist, right? You're a fascist. And Andy No is like, well, aren't we doing the same thing when we say you're communists? And Tim's like, no, because we're actually not fascists, materially or formally. And some of them might not be formally communists, they are all acting materialistically communistic. Okay, there's no question there. They're doing the same. A communist is as a communist does. Seems like a pretty obvious point, right? It does.
comfortable breaking free from that, saying, I don't want to be involved, and that's fine, they can. But for the time being, if BLM is coming out saying they're trained Marxists, and then I see videos of millennials and Gen Z doing the red salute, oh, bro, they're communists. Like, if you saw a 17-year-old kid marching around, goose-stepping and doing a Roman salute, you'd be like, he's a Nazi. Yeah. Right. Oh, well, hold on. Did he actually read Mein Kampf? Does he actually? Come on, dude. Like, we don't play those games. So
we don't play those games. I'm gaining so much respect for this guy. And again, please don't misunderstand me. When you say something like that, it sounds like you're putting yourself above somebody. I'm not sunning Tim Pool. He's younger than me. Maybe I should. Right? I'm not sunning him. I'm saying this is right. You don't play their games. You have to constantly be on your guard against the games that are often philosophical and linguistic in nature of the left. And you have to check yourself as to whether you're buying into those games or not. And usually that involves checking the terminology you're using and the moral arguments that you're making on the basis of that terminology. And Andy No just totally bought into this. Well, we can't do the same thing they're doing. And Tim's like, we're not, bro. And for you to assume that we are is for you to totally ignore this distinction between materially being something and formally being something. All right? Right. Yeah. Or I should say this, I'll say it the way I did earlier. Between this difference between formally being something and materially being something. Just because they're not waving the flag, just because they don't have the T-shirt on, doesn't mean they're not doing things as a communist does things. So it's not wrong to call them communists. So no, we're not doing the same thing that they're doing when we call them that.
Is high-profile activists to the tunes of millions of dollars buying property, having the slogans so ubiquitous that Amazon and Walmart use them.
Come on, Tim.
Like, okay, yeah, they're in the style of Chinese communism. They are authoritarian. Call them whatever you want. They adhere to some kind of Marxist ideology, likely as a means of manipulating. I think it's probably better to call them neo-fascist or something like this. A lot of people call them neo-Marxist, but I'm like, I don't think they actually believe what Marx believed. They're using Marxist ideas to manipulate stupid people into being controlled. Yeah. So it's something else.
And that's and the real mind behind Marxism, that's all he wanted. Okay? That's all he wanted. Is something that would allow him to manipulate people that way. I'm not talking about Marx. If you want to know who I'm talking about, listen to Unmasking Antifa.
Maybe, whatever. But call them whatever you want to call them. Marxist, communists, it applies to all of them. Yeah. And you can wake up one day and be like, oh, that was bad that I was doing that. There's a guy who I retweeted a while.
Okay, so you get the point. Now I'm just gonna let this play a little bit longer. I'm not gonna play this full 23-minute clip, but I do want to see if Andy No is like, oh, I get what you're saying. You're right, bro. Because to me, I mean, tell me what you think. There's no way around this point. Okay. And I think that if you're not willing to accept this point, you might not yet have seen sort of like the fault lines and the battle lines clearly. Like you might need to think about, like what we talked about in Unmasking Antifa. What is it at bottom, philosophically, psychologically, that makes someone a radical, that makes someone a leftist, that makes someone of this persuasion, right? And we identified in that series the very, very bottom fundamental philosophical assumption that generates communism. And guess what? It's the same fundamental philosophical assumption that generates fascism. Okay, people always talk. See, you have to be careful about the games that the left plays with you, because the left wants you to think that fascism is over here on the right. This is your right, and communism is over here on the left, right? But that framework is their creation. Okay, that's a false framework. Communism and fascism are of the same side. Once you understand what is the scale that the sides are balanced by, what is the scale? It's the fundamental philosophical assumption that generates how you will see all social and political life. And it's this: what is more primary? What is more fundamental? What is the most basic unit of social and political life? For the left, it's the group. It's what philosophers call the many. You don't get rights, you don't get anything until you have the agreement of the group. So all the supposed rights and properties that an individual has, on the left's view, only has it because of a decision of the group. The many is more fundamental than the one. The one is derivative of the many. For actual conservatives, for actual like right-thinking people, for the right, the real right, right? It's the opposite of that. The fundamental social political unit, the haver of rights, and thus the giver of rights, is not society. It's not the group. It's not the many. It's the one. So the left places the many superior to the one, and the right places the one superior to the many. And that is the most fundamental distinction, and that is actually what divides left and right. And when you understand that, then you'll see why this whole idea that fascism is far right and communism is far left, that this framework that the left wants you to see the world through. They want to put their rose-colored glasses on you, so you'll say that too, right? But that's not right, okay? Once you see that it's placing the many above the one, placing the many as more fundamental to the one, placing the group as more fundamental to the individual, making the individual derivative of the group rather than the group derivative of the individual. And then all the rights and properties and meaning and everything of the group as being superior to the individual. Once you see that communism and fascism both do that, and the opposite of doing that is what a conservative does, you'll see a conservative as being over here, and all those ideologies as being over here. You can't let the left define your framework. You can't look at things through their glasses. That's part of the trick. Okay? Now, like I said, I haven't seen whether Andy No acquiesces to Tim's point, but I'm very curious. So I'm just going to let this play a little bit longer.
A while ago, he was a doctor, and he tweeted that he was completely wrong about the lockdowns, and he apologizes. The data was bad, and he regrets where he was. And I'm like, see, there you go. You know, somebody who says, whoa, I can't believe what I was doing.
Yeah. And you can only really do that in one direction. You can do it from the left going to the right. You can't really do it from the left, or you can't really do it from the right going to the left. I don't think the left would just never have you.
No, they do. They have their I think it's all fake. The people were like, you know, I was a Trump supporter, and then I realized they were lying. No, you didn't. That's a lie. That's not true. Because the far right, as defined by the media and the establishment, includes libertarians who hate Donald Trump.
Yeah. Right.
So it's like somebody who was, you know, I'm sure there are people who have been blue-pilled, who have been manipulated and tricked into believing lies from the machine. But you have to be really insane or really broken to read facts about how the media lied, which brings you to Donald Trump, and then be like, yeah, but then I started reading more of NBC News and really just decided not to fact check it. It's like that simple. I'll give you an example. Burisma.
Yes, you see how the point he's making in particular maps onto our more general point earlier. If you're an ideologue, right, it makes sense to, at some point, somehow, you can see how a person would move from a recognition that they're an ideologue and they're not seeing the facts for what they are, but whether they're coloring the facts with the way they describe them and talk about them and look at them. They're using their ideology as a lens through which to see the facts. It makes more sense that person could disabuse themselves of that and see the facts for what they are. This is why we debate. This is why we dialogue. This is why people do podcasts. This is why we argue. This is why I'm talking right now, right? Like, it makes more sense that a person would go from that mistaken, errant way of thinking to going, oh, I wasn't appreciating that fact just as it is. I was coloring it, right? It makes more sense that they would move that way than it does that they would go, well, I'm going to go from a neutral observation of the facts and a fair-minded assessment of them to placing this lens over them through it. You wouldn't do that, right? Unless you had some ulterior motive in doing so. So if you have an ulterior motive in doing so, well, then you're already on the side, right? Materially, you're already part of the cult, and that's Tim's point. So it doesn't make sense. Again, we cannot equivocate. It's not the same thing to go this way as it is to go that way.
Is the best example, especially with everything that's going on.
I mean, to take a spiritual, biblical example. Should I do this? I mean, it makes sense to go from one way to the other, right? Naturally, it doesn't make sense to go the other way. The Bible says we are born sinners. We're born broken. We're born bent. Everybody starts out on this other side, and some people graduate to this new way of seeing things. You must be reborn, right? But it doesn't make sense to see things the correct way and then be like, "But I'm gonna." Right? If you're doing that, if you're saying I'm weighing the evidence, but now I'm not going to, then all right, then you have something else going on. If you have something else going on, agenda-wise, psychologically, spiritually, well, then you were already there, bro. So I'm still curious. I'm very curious as to whether Andy No is going to chime back in here. and be like, fair point, Tim.
There's no circumstance in which you can unlearn the Burisma scandal. Yeah. And if you go and say, I don't support Trump, Biden's the guy for me, go into a circle of Democrats and say, oh, yeah, but you know about Victor Shokin, right? When he signed the sworn affidavit saying Biden got him fired, they're going to be like, you're a Nazi. You're far right. Get out.
Yeah. I forget who it was that you were talking to. You read up on the show about that. They knew nothing about it. I can't remember who it was now.
Well, that's Brianna.
Come on, Andy.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's right.
It was Hunter
Avalon. Got to get out of here.
Yeah.
They have no idea this stuff happened, or they're lying and saying they didn't know that it happened. But the reality is, the people who are like, oh, I was a Trump supporter and now I'm not. Okay, maybe you are a Trump supporter because you were living under a rock and your neighbor said he was voting for Trump, so you said sure, but you're certainly not someone who pays attention.
You can't go the other way.
What's your take? Do you think that people are inaccurate when they criticize the left as being communists?
Well, he's already answered this question, hon. I'm not trying to be condescending. Like, he's already answered this question. The question is, has he now amended his view? Okay. Earlier he said, oftentimes, I think that they are. And the distinction for him, for Andy, between when they are doing the same thing the left is doing and when they're not, seem to be found in whether the person they're calling a communist is actually formally a card-carrying communist. Then it's accurate. But if they're not, then you shouldn't say it. Andy seems to think. And that's why Tim is fixated on all this. Like, bro, there's two different ways to be a communist.
Well, if Tim is specifically talking about the militant activists who use those symbols that are associated.
No, he's not, bro. He's not. You have not. Sorry, I don't want to be too hard on him. You haven't appreciated the point. He's saying those people, that's not the only way to be a communist.
With communism. Well, clearly those are apt.
Yes, they're apt. There's another way to be apt.
For them. I just, I cringe often when I see people on the right very kind of loosely.
Hey, I cringe is not an argument. That's not an argument, bro. That's a reaction. That's an emotional reaction. The question is your emotional reaction based in reality? Now, Tim just gave you a distinction that's based in reality. So what do you have to say to that?
Just calling random, large swaths of the political opposition, just, these are just all communists.
Look what he's done. People aren't calling random people communists. Tim is saying you can call a person who behaves as a communist materially. You can call that person, and by the way, no pun intended, material. You can call that person a communist, and you're not out of line in doing so. A communist is as a communist does. All right. And Andy is it's like the way Andy's talking right now, it's like Tim has not said anything up to this point. Like, Tim's made a perfectly valid point. So I guess I'm getting my question answered here as to whether Andy's going to appreciate the point. I would appreciate it if Tim would come back once more and be like, hey, you're ignoring what I just said. What do you have to say to that?
So we're using the term fascist as well. It just
one's true and one's not.
There, bro, there it is. Yeah, he's saying no, it is apt. To say that we're never apt in calling them communists is to say there's only one way to be a communist. Or to say that we're being irresponsible and calling all of them communists is to say that there's only one way of being a communist, and that one way is being a formally card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And that's just not the case, bro. So
important and meaning.
Ironic, right? Andy's like, language is so important. Yes, language is so important. And here you are operating, bro, in ignorance based on a sort of linguistic game, a language game that the left has played on you. An game of equivocation that the left has played on you. You don't have to be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party to be accurately described materially as a communist.
In the definitions of words is important, and I just, I think playing the same game of what
it's not the same
left does, of just, their disregard of who they call fascist or who they call far right, whatever. I think the right should be very careful not to mirror that in the same way. Unfortunately, I think that boat has already sailed.
But why shouldn't they mirror it?
There, thank you. Tim's like, look at this look on Tim's face. He's like, bro, I'm not letting you get away from this. And I'm frustrated that you're completely ignoring the analysis that I just did and just saying the same thing you said at the beginning of the conversation. Why shouldn't they fear being called that?
Are you implying that they're only saying it because it would
to mirror that in the same way? Unfortunately, I think that boat has already sailed.
But why shouldn't they mirror it? Are you
mirror what? The left calls everyone on the right fascist. Andy No says to call everyone on the left communist is to mirror what the left is doing, and you shouldn't do that. Tim's like, no. Why shouldn't they mirror it? The only answer that Andy can give here is essentially to lean on the assumption that there's only one way of being a communist, and since not all of them are in possession or practice that way of being communist, then we're wrong to call them all communists. And Tim's like, bro, I just said you could be materially a communist or formally a communist. You're still a communist. A communist is as a communist does.
Implying that they're only saying it because it was said of them.
Yeah. Why is Tim saying this? He's saying, no, you're this is what C.S. Lewis called bulverism, right? Andy, why are you saying, why do you think the folks on the right are calling all the folks on the left communist? Is it, you think it's only because of what was said to them, or do you think they actually have a reason that they're identifying that person as communist? Tim's like, they have a reason. Now, Andy could be like, well, they're not a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And Tim's going to say, that's not the only reason you would call someone a communist, bro. Material, formal. Banality, explicit. I hope this is clear by now. I really hope Andy sees this.
Yes, and it's about sort of like just this rhetorical claim of like, okay, you call us, you're so loose with the word fascist on our side. We're just gonna call all of you.
That's
not
communists.
what's happening.
That's not what they do.
It is a fact that they're communists. It is not a fact.
Some of them.
But right. So you're
see, you see, Andy says no. Some of them, because in Andy's mind, the only way to be a communist is to have a card in your wallet that says I'm a communist and explicitly think I want to carry out a communist idea in society. And Tim's like, that's not the only way to be a communist. So it's only because you think that's the only way to be a communist that you're saying that these people over here are guilty of false attribution when they attribute communism to half this group.
Defining communist as someone who is a learned red communist as opposed to the banality of communism.
Not even necessarily learned. They could just, somebody who's just finds appeal in the basic tenets of communism. That's
like,
particularly
if a guy is puts on a black hoodie and runs around with Antifa smashing things, is he a communist?
Yes.
Not necessarily. He might identify as a militant anarchist.
Look how Andy has fallen in for what the left does. He just answered Tim by saying, but the guy might identify as an anarchist. What do you think Tim's going to say here? He's going to say, bro, it doesn't matter what you identify as. You don't get to create your own framework through which we see you. You're behaving in this way. This is in line with this ideology. You're acting out these principles. You're a member of that group. I don't care if you call yourself a dolphin, bro. It's like you're behaving as a communist. It's not false to call you a communist. And Andy can only say, well, he might not identify as a communist. Identify, ID, wallet, card-carrying member, formal communism. Tim's like, that's not the only way to be a communist. This is actually pretty frustrating to watch.
That's a big part of the Antifa.
But that's not anarchy. Anarchy meaning without authority, right? So they can call themselves whatever they want. I don't care. That's not true. Anarchists are not violent. Right?
That's right.
Well,
now look what Tim's doing. Tim is a smart guy. Tim knows that when he says this, you're thinking in your mind, anarchists aren't violent. But I have images in my mind of anarchists in black masks, and hoodies throwing bombs, that's what I'm flames and chaos, right? He knows that in your mind, that's what you think of an anarchist. Tim doesn't care. He's saying, what is the definition of an anarchist? How does an anarchist behave based on the idea of anarchism? Whether he right? An anarchist is someone who is against all rules. So they can't be authoritarian in nature, because to be authoritarian in nature, you would have to be for rules of some sort. So anyone who behaves as the way that your little mental image of an anarchist is behaving is not really an anarchist. They're something else. They might identify themselves as an anarchist, but let's be real. An anarchist is this sort of thing. And whether somebody explicitly believes themselves to be that or just acts that way, only a person who acts in accord with the principle that there are no rules and can be no rules, only that person's a real anarchist. So you don't get to cordon off this group of the left who doesn't see themselves as communists, but rather calls themselves anarchists, and say it's because of the existence of these folks that we over here can't say you guys are communists. Those people are falsely attributing anarchism to themselves. See, Tim is sharp, and he's really, I think, in this clip, he's making a point very clear to Andy that it's very frustrating that Andy can't see, and that's that Andy has accepted the linguistic, the language framework, the philosophical framework, he's accepted the framework of the left, and he's seeing things through it.
If the far left,
there are examples in 20th century European history of, anarchist ideologues who've carried out assassinations,
but that's not
and other types of violence.
So I would argue the core of the phrase "without authority"
Anarchy.
would displace a person from the use of violence, and someone who wants to claim they're an anarchist who then engages in, say, throwing dynamite in a market or something like that. They're not an anarchist.
Right.
That's an authoritarian action.
That's right.
Anarchy is quite literally the word "and" without archy, authority.
This man's a clear
Anybody
thinker.
who believes that there is no authority to the system, one could make the philosophical argument that they're trying to strip authority from the system. That's why they're an anarchist. That's not correct in most anarchist philosophy. That's why you'll find among libertarians and what people refer to as right anarchists, the non-aggression principle. If you use violence against another person, it's an assertion of your authority over them,
That's
which
right.
defies itself. What is
you're not
actually
an
happening
anarchist.
is if you look at the anarchist communities, they have inherently tanky authoritarian views on how to run society.
They're communists.
Then they just say, but I'm an anarchist.
Exactly.
Sure.
All right.
Like, dude, just because you're stupid doesn't mean you're not a communist.
Exactly, bro.
If
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. All right, I'm gonna let it play another minute or so. I just want to see if Andy comes around. Man, I don't think he's going to, based on the fact that he hasn't seen it up to this point. But let's see.
They believe Marxist ideology, utilize that ideology to and utilize violence to that end. They're not anarchists. They are someone who believes in an authority, believes in a system, believes that it should be done the way they want it done, and that they are the ones who have the right to use cause of death to get that. That's not anarchy. Mm-hmm. So this is the issue that we've always had going back to Occupy Wall Street, when these dudes would dress up in all black, and people would call them the anarchists and stuff. And we would colloquially say it sometimes, but being friends with a bunch of anarchists, especially with like Ron Paul Revolution only a few years before, we were like, that's not anarchy. Running around smashing windows and beating people up because they don't agree with you is quite literally what anarchists are opposed to.
That's Marxism.
When you argue that the police, for instance, were doing something wrong and they were abusing people, or saying the street was frozen, you couldn't go there, it was an arbitrary exercise of authority over people that was ill-gotten. It was false. When people started putting on hoodies and masks, a uniform, going around saying, do what we say or we will physically strike you, I was like, identical to the police.
Yep.
And they would go, that's so stupid. We are not. And I'm like, bro, two guys who are part of groups that dress the same and assert their authority, whether it's warranted or not.
That's authoritarianism.
But this is just
Come on, Andy.
No true Scotsman argument.
No, it's not.
No, it's not, bro. Bro, see, now this is Andy. Oh, man, I'm so glad I let it play. Do you guys know what the no true Scotsman fallacy is? In logic, there's different fallacies, right? There's different mistakes that you can make in thinking, right? There's formal fallacies that have to do with just the structure of your premises with respect to your argument, and there's informal fallacies that more have to do with the substance of what's being said and why the conclusion, for one reason or another, doesn't follow from those premises substantially. Okay, now there's some sort of there's some fallacies that you'll find like in the logic textbook, and there's some sort of like fallacies that have just sort of evolved in the discussions and the communities of people who think and talk about this stuff. Is like they're kind of the no true Scotsman fallacy is like when you say, well, no true Scotsman, no true blank. Like nobody who was really a Scotsman would believe blank, right? And the opponent says, well, so what? Well, McGregor believes blank, and he's a Scotsman, right? And the person who gave the original argument is like, well, then he's not a real Scotsman. Why? Because I have this framework. I have this lens that says no real Scotsman would do or say those things. So you can't bring me countervailing evidence. You can't bring me a piece of data like McGregor or Mick whatever. Those are Scots names, right? Is that... whatever. Right? You can't bring me a Scotsman as a counterexample because I'm not going to accept it. Why am I not going to accept it? Because no true Scotsman would blank. I'm not being empirical. I'm being an ideologue. Okay? So Andy is saying that all Tim is engaged in here is redefinition. Ironically, that's what Andy's doing. He's accepted the redefinition of the left. Tim is pointing out the actual definitions of words and whether the way a person is behaving is in line with those or not. And Andy's so drunk on this framework. The framework is so, his picture is, his face, his head is so in the frame, he can't pull back enough to see the borders of the frame.
It's the if someone comes to you and says they're a thing, does it mean they are a thing? No, it does not. Words define things. So if someone comes to you and they're clearly a white blonde guy and they say, actually, I'm a black guy from Nigeria, you're going to be like, you are actually a white guy, right?
But within political philosophies, if there is a faction that identifies within this larger political ideology and they carry out actions that, in the name of this ideology, I don't think we should necessarily just say, well, they're not acting truly in for this particular cause. I get into, there are a lot of women's rights activists who actually really disagree with the work I do, because I particularly talk about how a lot of these women's rights events, it's Antifa,
this is getting very murky. He's confusing the issue. And I think I don't think it's maybe intentional obfuscation here. I think he doesn't quite know where to go with the point that's been made against him.
Communists and socialists and violent far left coming up to attack these women who are speaking out about trans ideology. Well, a lot of these women who are speaking out are old school leftists who say, no. These people, they're not leftists. They're not on our side. They have nothing to do with us. They're regressive. They're not on the same side as us. And I think that type of denial, it's not reflective of the reality that the on the ground manifestation of political philosophy does change over time. You're not going to have necessarily a pure manifestation every time, but it's still part of that. And I think
this has missed the point.
I think within the wider anarchist community, anarchists need to start asking themselves a bit more, if they're not doing already, why are some of the most prominent anarchists we see doing the direct action on the street are the militant Antifa?
Because they're not anarchists. Your position comes from if a person declares themselves to be, they are.
Yes, exactly.
If a communist came out and said, don't worry, I'm not a communist, am I going to be like, well, hold on, guys, they're not a communist? He's like, he's wearing a blue jumpsuit with a little commie hat on, holding Das Kapital and waving a communist flag. I am not a communist. I say, okay, he's not.
See, the material formal distinction. This is disappointing. I don't know a lot about this Andy No guy, but this is, I'm sorry. I'm sure he's right on a lot of stuff. I'm sure he seems like a very level-headed guy, but this is a very basic point. I don't have to declare myself to be a communist to be a communist. A communist is as a communist does. Communism is a set of ideas that generate behaviors based on the values contained in those ideas. If I behave in accordance with those values which stem from those ideas, I'm a communist.
He said he's not, so he's not, right? That's illogical.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. You can have, people can pick and cherry pick whatever aspects of different texts or historical figures who may represent that political ideology and draw inspiration from it and say that is, that they're part of a longer tradition. It's just,
maybe the reason Andy can't see that these people are in line with the group that he acknowledges as communists is because he does not have a fully formed picture of what the borders of this group are, because he can't see the frame. He hasn't stepped back enough. He hasn't really understood what it is at bottom, psychologically, mentally, spiritually, philosophically, metaphysically, ontologically, whatever you want to call it, that makes someone a leftist. I think Tim has a much better sense of that. It's their placement, and he doesn't say this explicitly. I wish he would get philosophical in this way. I think he's really getting close to it's that they place the group above the individual, or I should say above, below. The group is more fundamental. The group is the fundamental unit of society, and therefore it's the fundamental holder and giver of all value and meaning and significance. And that's the same for fascism and communism and any other collectivism. Over and against that, you have the person who metaphysically, philosophically, ontologically, however you want to say it, sees the individual as the fundamental unit of society. And that person will inevitably tend towards and be conservative, because for them, meaning and significance and value and all those things are held by the individual primarily, and the society, the group, only gets them derivatively. That's what the Declaration of Independence says, right? That's what Locke was about. That's what makes someone a conservative. Okay. And no, okay, I was about to say something, go off in a totally different direction, but that's a deeper point. You understand? Andy doesn't see that. He doesn't have a clear picture of what makes someone one or the other. So he's inaccurately he's inaccurately charging Tim as describing the territory inaccurately. When Tim's like, bro, look at the map. And Andy doesn't have a good map.
I just get frustrated when there's like
so the issue right now is
not recognizing a problem on one's own side, which I see the left does.
No, but the right is not.
That's begging the question. You haven't yet made the point that the problem exists on our side. The whole question at hand is whether this same problem exists on our side. Okay? And to make good on that claim, you will have to answer this distinction that Tim has identified between the banality of evil and explicit evil, or between material communism and formal communism. In other words, you will have to make clear just what it is fundamentally that makes someone a communist. And Tim's whole point is, it's not carrying the card, bro.
Not wrong to call them communists. So libertarians, conservatives, evangelicals, post-liberals, non-politically affiliated people comprise the far right. All of those people I just described, this disparate group of people who completely disagree with each other and will actually yell at each other in arguments, are called one group fascists. All of them. That's nonsensical and incorrect. Mm-hmm. You get a libertarian, you get Dave Smith in here, and he will tell you why he does not like Donald Trump. But the media and the Democrats will still claim he's a Trump supporter. Thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast.
All right, like I said, I really like this guy. Like we should all find ourselves disagreeing with each other at points. So I'm not gonna, I don't agree with everything Tim says, but I find him to be one of the most clearest and incisive thinkers in my own. You know how we all go through our day-to-day lives, like ingesting what's going on out there in the discussions. We have the shows that we go to and stuff like that. And frequently, when I'm like doing the dishes or doing the laundry or something, I'll listen to the clips from Tim's show. And this was a really interesting clip. And like I said at the beginning, I haven't really known. Specifically of Andy No. I've only sort of heard about him peripherally and tangentially, and I know that he's been involved in like a lot of the discussions that I was involved in when I was making that series Unmasking Antifa. But what I've heard him say today has not given me any reason to believe that he correctly sees the territory. And I think Tim does, and I hope it's been clear here why. This is a Hemlock reaction, and I hope to do more of these. Peace.